The question is, do you agree that Scotland should be an independent country?
For me, the principle that we work best when we work together.
Well, they didn't.
Very serious. The referendum. It seems to me that they're not dealing with the issues.
Hi, the Scottish Independence Podcast is your chance to hear some different views on what the independence referendum means for Scotland.
Hello, and welcome to Scottish Independence Podcast number 18. This is a little bit of a change from our regular programming because we've moved for all that to Wednesday for this week, but it'll all be back to normal for next week. This week's a very interesting topic. We're going to talk about the Scots language because I'm sure many of you have had experiences where you've been told that you were speaking incorrectly or that certain words you were using were vulgar and it's not the correct way to speak. And I spoke to the director of the Scots Language Centre, Michael Hance, about this topic, about the work that they do at the centre, and some of the historical problems that the language has faced, and how it's amazing how it continues to survive, given the historical situation. We also talked about how the situation has been improving recently, and how it could improve further still. I'm sure you'll think it's an interesting conversation, so we'll go straight to it, and I'll have a wee word with you at the end. I'm here with Michael Hance, the director of the Scots Language Centre. So, hello Michael, how are you doing?
I'm not bad. How are you doing yourself?
Not too bad. So, I suppose the Scots language is a very interesting part in this debate because it's been mentioned on previous podcasts many times that many of our guests and myself have recollections of being told that the language that we were using is vulgar, or people being punished for speaking in Scots when they were younger. It certainly happened at my school. So I think it's a very interesting area. Is it a kind of thing about oppression, or is it not? And then just the first question, I suppose, before we get around to that sort of stuff is Scots, and this is a biggie because lots of people debate about this constantly, but is Scots a language in and of itself, or is it a dialect of English?
Well, no, it's not a dialect of English at all. I mean, if you turn the question round, is English a dialect of Scots? I mean, it's clearly a ludicrous and ridiculous question, but the truth of the matter is that the two speech forms, let's call them that, have a common root, and they diverged at one point, and in 1707, one of them went on to develop into a modern European language because it was associated with the institutions of the state, art and literature, and the other one didn't because it wasn't associated with the institutions of the state. And clearly over the period between then, 1707 and now, being able to speak English was a marker of wealth, success and educational attainment. So at some point, these things become fixed in people's minds. It becomes the case that people think that English and these other things go together, and Scots and the opposite of those things go together. But that's just a cultural phenomenon rather than anything else. The amazing thing about Scots is that it survived. I mean, what an incredible thing if you think about it. 1707 to now, and of course the previous 104 years, 1603 to 1707, when the court moved south, and the patronage that the court gave to the arts and production of cultural material in Scots means that for about 400 years now, Scots has been under a huge amount of pressure, but thousands and hundreds of thousands of people still speak it in Scotland today. So I think that the argument about is Scots a language, is it not, is just an absolute dead end. It's a form of speech which is used by hundreds of thousands of people on a daily basis to communicate with their friends, their family, at work, and in all sorts of social and other situations.
Do you think that, okay, you're saying it's amazing that it's survived, but do you think there's been a certain kind of dilution? Like, if you look at some of the older things that are written, you could say, it's kind of pure Scots, but maybe now people speak kind of English with a few Scots words thrown in, or do you still think it's very strong?
Well, some people say that the way that most people describe this, academics describe it, is that they say there's a continuum. So at one end, there's people who speak what might be called braid Scots. Okay, I'm not particularly happy with that term, but that's what folk usually call it.
Could you explain that a little bit, the term?
braid Scots, but it just means kind of broad Scots. It means like, but this is the problem with the term, is that it kind of doesn't tell you very much. But when academics talk about this, academic linguists, what they usually talk about is something at one end called braid Scots, right? So let's say that's the most densely Scots form of Scots, which you might find some old farmer in Bamshire or something speaking, or some old wifey in a croft on Yale or something speaking. And then at the other end, what you get is something called Scottish Standard English, which is probably what you get somebody speaking if they happen to live in Edinburgh Newtown or Carstorphine or something of that nature. So what they say is that on this continuum, there's a big space in between broad Scots at one end and braid Scots at one end and Scottish Standard English at the other, and some people are neither one end or the other end. Okay, so this is how folk usually talk about this stuff. And I guess people are usually somewhere in between. I mean, there'll be very few people who only ever talk Scots and only ever talk SSE, or folk who do talk SSE, of course, have to understand Scots, because they have to, if you happen to be living in the Newtown, and your plumbing goes wrong, you've got to get somebody in to help you fix it. And, often what you'll be finding is that the person coming in to fix it is someone who doesn't speak exactly like you. Rather, you've got to talk to that person. But in terms of dilution, this idea of dilution, well, I was having an interesting conversation with somebody about this the other day. It was concerning the word elka. Now, I don't know if you know what that means, but it means each. So elk-ain means each one, or elka-day means every day. And somebody said to me recently, this week, in fact, that word isn't used any longer, but I see it written down by Scots language activists and literary types. And there was a question about whether that was appropriate or not to use language which appears to have died out. But when I was young, that word was used. Elka was used frequently. I mean, I heard people say it. Now, I'm talking about the 60s, 70s and 80s here, so it's not that long ago. And then we had this discussion about, well, where did it go and how did it disappear? Because I don't think there can be many people nowadays who do use it. Maybe that old farmer in Bamshire and the old wifey in the croft in Yale or something use it. But of course, the reason it isn't used anymore is because people aren't subjected to seeing it and hearing it echoed back at them. The word actually is the same in Dutch. In Dutch, it's something like elka. I can't speak Dutch, but I see it written down when I'm in Holland, and it looks very much like the Scots word, and it must sound very much like an elka. But it hasn't gone out of use in Holland, or the Netherlands rather, in Dutch-speaking communities, is because Dutch-speaking people hear it every day on television. They read it every day in the newspaper. They hear it every day on the radio. So they're living in a linguistic space which confirms and reaffirms the language that they use. We're living in a linguistic space where the language that people use is constantly under pressure. The alternative forms, which have this higher social status, this higher linguistic status, are the ones which are reinforced and echoed back at folk. So the likelihood of people maintaining their linguistic forms in the face of that pressure is quite small, in truth. And that's why I make the point about it being remarkable that Scots has survived, because the pressure is enormous. And it's not just that we are faced with a language which is a higher prestige, it's also the global language. So in the face of that, this extraordinary pressure that Scots faces, it's of course clearly going to be the case that there is dilution occurs. What you've got to work out if you're a Scots language activist or a person who wants to campaign for Scots is, what do you do about that? How do you respond to it? And should you respond to it? Because some people say, well, language has moved on. You've got to accept that and go with it.
Well, what do you think about the idea? It's a quote I've always loved. It's actually by an English anti-fascist writer called Storm Jameson, where she says language is memory and metaphor.
Well, I'm not a very erudite person, Michael, so I'm not totally sure what that means. But memory and metaphor, well, I suppose that's what it is. Yes, maybe, you're right.
With the memory and metaphor idea, because this is going to lead on to one of the accusations that's given for Knots, one of the ideas that people say is not a good idea to continue with Scots, because with its memory and metaphor, it's a way to hold on to the Scottish culture. That's why it's important as memory and metaphor, because older songs and the poetry of Burns, if you like, and many other people is written in that language. So it's the cultural memory and the cultural metaphor is contained within the language. But
Well, I totally agree with you on that. And one of the things that I think about in those terms, I mean, for me, I wasn't really sure what the suddenly you're presented with what sounds like a very erudite and thoughtful quote, and you think, what the hell does that mean? And to be honest, I wasn't very sure. But I think that I do agree with that. I think it is important. And for me, this whole business about, well, what is Scotland, is connected intimately with the language, with the languages that we speak. Now, the languages we speak in this country are English, Gaelic and Scots. But the Scots, I think, is probably, this is a controversial thing to say, but I think Scots, for most people, is the most important one, because it's the one they're most intimately connected with, and it's one that does bring the centuries of the existence of this country to life for them. I always say to people, if you think people sometimes think Scots is just some kind of a heritage artefact. It doesn't really matter. But the fact of the matter is this, at least this is my view. If you took all the things that are Scots language and you took them all and you put them in a big box and you threw them into the North Sea, well, Scotland would be nothing like the place it is now. It would be unrecognisable as the culture and the country that Scotland has been and is at present. So Scots isn't just something that's a sideshow, it's the absolute central part of what Scotland is for vast numbers of people who live in this country.
there's an accusation that, in this day and age, how does it serve us to make ourselves more difficult to understand? And my kind of response to that has been, it's kind of ridiculous, because every single test, it's not that you do one or the other, it's bilingual. Every single test has shown that it helps children and people in life to be bilingual in every sense. So why can't they be bilingual with Scots or English? Even trilingual, learn another language like French.
Well, I would hope that, we can see a future where Scottish people are not isolated linguistically like they are at present in some horrible English language prison. That's what we're actually faced with just now. We're in this very unusual position in Europe. We know why this has come about. We know that the British Empire and the American Empire have brought about the situation where English is the dominant language, and we happen to have access to it through our own history, through being part of that imperial project. But we're very isolated by it. We're cut off from our European neighbours by this inability to speak other languages. But it's not just the inability to speak other languages, it's the disconnection from our own linguistic heritage. And we can speak our own language, many of us, but not in the fullest sense. So we've got this stumbling, stuttering approach to languages, and it's a terrible burden that we have in Scotland. So I'm looking forward to the time when people will not see being able to speak Scots as any kind of barrier to anything. Anybody who wants to learn Norwegian or Swedish or Danish or Dutch, for example, will find Scots an enormous help. I mean, going to these countries and learning the languages, it becomes faster and easier. I don't think that speaking Scots is an impediment to anything. In fact, it's a mechanism by which you can unlock huge cultural treasures and cultural wealth and the capacity to expand linguistically. I don't see it as any kind of impediment to understanding the world better or to connecting to the rest of the world in any way at all. But the other thing that it gives us is the capacity to understand ourselves, to connect with our own heritage.
So could you tell us a bit about the work you do at the Scots Language Centre, what projects you have going?
The Centre is an information gathering and distribution centre, or distribution institution, and basically what it does is we do all our work online. So we collect information about what's happening with Scots in various parts of the country, what folk are doing culturally, what people are doing to learn the language, what people are doing to encourage the language, and then we represent that information on our website. And we're obviously very active on Twitter and Facebook as well. And we try to create a space in which people can talk about Scots, they can present information about Scots, and we do that in a kind of non-judgmental way. So we don't take a kind of censorious view about language at all. We try to encourage real diversity with Scots in terms of dialect, register, experimentation with writing, and the other thing we really focus on is spoken Scots. because in the past, a lot of Scots language organisations have been really focused on literature and trying to make a connection with historical literary forms in order to increase. It's perfectly natural for them to have done it, but it's to try to enhance the status of spoken Scots. But our view is, if you want to speak about Scots to Scots speakers, you've got to speak to them in Scots about that. So what we do is we have tons of material on the